Okay, thanks a lot. So, am I on here? Okay. So, 10 minutes is not a lot of time, so I'm going to give you a very broad brush, high-level overview, but I just wanted to let you know a little bit about what our organization is. So, you probably all know there's a laboratory up at the top of the hill called Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. It's there's about 3,200 people that work there. Quite a number of joint faculty with campus here. I see one of them right over there, Peter Nugent. There are like 500 postdocs up there, quite a number of students as well. And the laboratory is all about solving major problems in basic science, energy, and to some extent security. The lab also designs, builds, and operates very large scientific user facilities that I'll talk a little bit more, and unique user facilities I'll talk a little bit more about too. And I mentioned the postdocs and students. We do have a role in education and training the next generation of scientists. And I mentioned the user facilities. So, for example, the big one up on the hill that you can see from down here is the Advanced Light Source, ALS. It's a big synchrotron. It produces X-rays that are used at something like 46 end stations, basically to look at things at the molecular and atomic level. You can think of it as a giant microscope. The Joint Genome Institute, which is actually over in Walnut Creek, it's the first place that the human genome was sequenced. Is part of the laboratory as well, and it still is a large genomics institute. Molecular Foundry is a big facility up there where people synthesize and analyze new materials, so solid-state materials, biomaterials, that sort of thing. Very state-of-the-art facilities. And the National Center for Electron Microscopy is also there, so there's some very large electron microscopes. These are all user facilities. People come from all over the world to use them. And from our perspective in computing, one of the most important things these days is that they're producing more and more data. So as the technology for measuring things becomes more and more sophisticated, you measure more and more data, and you need more and more computing to be able to analyze and make sense out of the data. And so that has become one of the major roles of my division, is working with people in these user facilities, and also areas of science where data is becoming an increasing issue. Now, for those of you who don't know about the National Laboratory System, we're one of 17 national laboratories around the country. You can see where they all are. Of course, we're right here, but they're all over the country, and you've probably heard of places like Los Alamos and Lawrence, Livermore, Oak Ridge, and Argonne. There's a number of high-energy physics, or what used to be high-energy physics facilities like SLAC over at Stanford and so forth. If you've walked up Hearst Avenue lately and looked up on the hill, you can't have failed to notice a giant blue building up there, which they promised us would be invisible from down here. I understand you can see it from Lake Merritt. It's so big. But this is the new Computational Research and Theory Facility. It actually will be christened as Wang Hall. It's in fact a building that partly belongs to the University of California, and it will be the home for most of a large fraction of all the computing activities going on up on the hill. So the NERSC Supercomputer Center, which is currently down in Oakland, is moving up into this building. Something called ESNet, which I'll mention in a minute, is moving to the building, and part of my organization is moving into the building as well. And in particular, it will be the Berkeley Lab home for BIDS. So there's going to be a number of offices there and some collaboration space, not quite as big as the space here, but sort of similar sort of concept. And in fact, Fernando Perez will be the leader up there on the hill of this piece of BIDS. So this is good to know about, and you can see on the aerial. Here's BIDS and here's the CRT facility. So we're just as close to you here as the football stadium is. So it's really not very far away. A little bit farther up the hill, but. So computing sciences at Berkeley Lab. Berkeley Lab does a broad array of scientific activities. Everything, there's biosciences, chemistry, material sciences, all kinds of physics, and so forth. The computing sciences area has 3 major divisions in it. One is the NERSC facility, the supercomputers. I mentioned ESNet, which is basically, you can think of that as the internet for science. So ESNet is a network which spreads all across the country, and in fact over into Europe as well. And what's different about ESNet from like Comcast is that ESNet focuses on moving very large data sets efficiently and without error across very long distances, whereas the commercial internet is basically all about moving small packets around, watching movies these days and so forth, where moving data with errors is not such a problem. So we run the ESNet facility for the Department of Energy. And then in computational research, my division, there are 4 departments: applied math, computer science, data science, computational science. Data science and technology is a department run by Deb Agrawal, who many of you may know. She's one of the BIDS fellows. This is not the only place that there are data science activities. In fact, when we looked around, we realized that data science shows up almost everywhere in the organization. There's 110 research staff, so it is kind of the size of 4 research staff are sort of equivalent to faculty members down here, so anything from sort of a assistant professor level up to a full professor level, and we have about 30 postdocs. So that's the size of the organization. There are a number of CRD, number of BIDS fellows up in CRD, and 2 of them are sitting right here. So Danny Ushizima right over there, and Peter Nugent, but there's 5 of us: Deb, Wes Bethel, and Jamie Sethian as well. And I think that's it, right? Anybody else been named since this was? Yeah, okay. So and they were named shortly after BIDS was formed. You've probably heard about, you may have heard about, in fact it was on the BIDS website recently, the new camera project, which recently got a $10.5 million award from the Department of Energy. This is run by Jamie Sethian, and this is a center that's all about taking state-of-the-art mathematics and applying it to data problems, particularly for the large light sources around the country. So the advanced light source is one example of that. And this, I'm not going to go through the slide, but there's a number of activities that have already happened under the auspices of camera, of developing mathematical techniques and software which allow people to analyze data in ways that they couldn't before. And you can see Danny's a member of camera. She's been responsible for a lot of the image analysis work that has gone on there. Peter is part of this activity here, Peter Nugent. So 21st century cosmology is in some sense one of the best examples of how computational science, or science itself, has transformed from being not really computational to being very computational. And in fact, computational science has transformed from just being largely a tool for the theoretical side of science. So modeling and simulation is basically solving equations on big computers, to being part of experimental and observational science as well. So because of the quantities of data and so forth, you need clever mathematics and lots of computing to be able to handle all the data. And cosmology is an example of where data analysis issues and modeling and simulation get combined together in order to get the sort of understanding you need to make discoveries such as the 2 Nobel Prizes that are indicated down here. So people in the group that Peter is in worked with both Saul and George, yes, of course, George Smoot on their Nobel Prizes. Here's another example of combining simulation and data. So this is an area which is traditionally thought of as being computational modeling and simulation, which is studying combustion by solving partial differential equations on a big computer. But one of the issues with doing combustion simulations is, in order to represent the actual situations you're interested in, you need to understand what all the parameters in the problem are that, for example, reaction rates and so forth that occur in the combustion. Combustion is basically a chemical reaction, or a large group of chemical reactions, and so you're simulating chemical reactions going on in a fluid flow. And experimentally determined databases for a lot of the parameters are very important, but the sort of error bars on these things is not very well known. And so one of the clever ideas that people are working on is a Bayesian framework for trying to use both the experimental data and the simulations together to try to put better error bounds on the parameters that are used for the simulation. And also it helps, in some sense, the equations can help constrain what the physical parameters have to be in ways that you wouldn't be able to do using by experimental measurements. So this is work going on in our applied math department. Here's another example of things going on. So iterative scripting of large-scale data-intensive workflows. So one of the big problems with science now, with all the data and all the things you're doing with computers and the experimental equipment and so forth, is just keeping track of the basic scientific workflow. So all the things that you learned about in college, where you write everything in a notebook and keep track of everything going on in the experiment. Because of the scale of what's going on, you really need to keep track of these computationally. And so designing these data-intensive workflows is really important. And this is an example of a project, Tigris, which is looking at developing reusable templates for building these computational workflows that can run on all kinds of different platforms, from high-performance computing platforms down to desktops or laptops. And Lavanya Ramakrishnan is the PI of that project. And then the last thing I'll mention is work on climate change, actually. So a question that, one of the things people are trying to understand is what will be the impact of climate change on extreme weather events. And the way this was investigated was to do many large-scale simulations of the Earth's climate with different inputs, based on different scenarios for what would happen in terms of climate change, and then having to mine this data and figure out basically, how many cyclones, tropical cyclones, will there be? Will there be more? Will there be fewer? Will they be stronger? Will they be weaker? What exactly is going to happen? And when you realize that each one of these simulations is tens to hundreds of terabytes of data, you're not going to figure this out by just looking at the pictures and counting up the hurricanes. And so machine learning turned out to be very, very important. Image processing, machine learning turned out to be very important to automatically identifying these sort of things. And instantly the answer is, at least based on the studies, that there'll be fewer, stronger tropical cyclones, which is, more, in other words, more extreme weather, but it won't happen quite so often. But in the end, the impact on human society has more to do with the scale rather than the quantity, and so not that surprising. So there's a lot more going on. I just picked 4 projects out of the tens, if not hundreds, of projects going on in our organization. We have a website. You can check out crd.lbl.gov, which has always got news events going on. In fact, new funding for camera seems to have shown up here. Let's see what else. But you can read about the research going on in the different departments by looking under these websites here. There's a link to the camera project if you want to learn more about that. For students and so forth, actually there's information about summer programs available and future career opportunities within our organization. And that's really all I was going to say. So happy to answer any questions.